r/NoSleep. Posted by you/IEscapedFromALab. If you go kayaking in Florida, do not bring back souvenirs. Please like and subscribe to support us. I moved to Florida from Tennessee a while ago after losing my job at a major university. I wasn't a teacher, I just worked in administration until I had a slight nervous breakdown, after which my employers became aware of a mental illness I had been hiding. I resumed a once heavy habit, but still more acceptable than mental illness, of heavy drinking while searching for a new position. My name is Bill Baker, and I guess you could say I'm a work in progress at best. So I landed in Lake Worth, Florida and got a shitty job at a grimy convenience store covered in weird signs and stickers that sells live fishing bait and expensive craft beer. I ended up moving in with my fish-scented manager Emilio pretty quick after my month-to-month landlord upped the rent. He had bought the house for cheap after the market crash. He lives with 3 sandy-colored black-mouthed curs, Benson, Jasper and Hammond, in a Spanish mission house in downtown Lake Worth with a wood ceiling and a massive untended backyard. Jasper is my favorite because he whines if someone enters the house without paying attention to him. Emilio had a side gig selling weed he usually buys off of Alpha Bay and is generally pretty cool in addition to being a great chef. Aside from the backyard, which I never ventured in and rarely saw because of the sheer amount of dog poo there, I thought it was the nicest place I had ever lived. Oddly enough, this meant that I switched from alcohol to weed and stopped being so moody. In no time he managed to get me out fishing and toking off of a bridge leading to Palm Beach Island, and eventually off of a cheap ocean kayak I bought on Craigslist. I started kayaking frequently even without the fishing gear. About 7 months ago Emilio, who used a canoe so he could bring his doggos on journeys, and I pulled up to a mangrove island in the Intercoastal to smoke a bit. The Intercoastal in West Palm Beach is filled with tiny islands that are more like sandbars moored by endless mangrove roots, each one being no bigger than a tennis court. The trees are so thick on these islands that you usually can't see the ground, much less the water on the other side. They're little patches of Florida that somehow escaped civilization and now lay stranded from what was once an incredible wetlands. Naturally, these spots were perfect for some relaxation if you knew the area. He started playing some ICP and other intentionally obnoxious music and getting our booze out of the ice while I rolled a blunt and wondered if I wasn't better off in this responsibility-free tropical purgatory. Jasper licked the sugary adhesive of the tips of my fingers gratefully before hopping into the water to chase Hammond. Being able to not kill myself around ICP and having a good time with drugs reminded me of just how far away I was from the person I was trying to be. I could barely remember my shitty office job or the drinks I had every lunch. After a few hours of playing with the dogs and getting wasted, Hammond, who is quite an explorer, swam around part of the island and suddenly started barking like crazy. Not just excited barking, something was clearly wrong. Emilio shot up and dove into the water closest to him, knowing it would be faster to swim around to island to where Hammond was than go through the thick walls of vegetation. Just in case it was lighter on this island I decided to go through the trees. Emilio got to Hammond a minute or two before I did. Hammond was pacing at one end of the clearing while Emilio crouched over what looked like a big pile of garbage that for just a moment almost appeared to be in the shape of a person. Detritus had collected haphazardly around a stone that Emilio was focused on. "Everything cool? Yeah, come check this out real quick, it's a cool rock or something." Emilio happily picked the thing up from the very top of the pile and showed it to me. The stone was slightly oblong and the waters had smoothed its surface into a shape that approximated 2 eyes, a mouth and a nose. Emilio picked it up and turned to show it to me. It was like limestone, but was darker in shade and harder than normal. This may have been because something was clearly fossilized inside of it, with the smooth round edges of whatever it was emerging gracefully from the sides of the smooth light brown stone and a thick mass of tiny appendages at the bottom. It was pretty cool looking and Emilio was staring happily at it, so I suggested he take it with us. Benson grumbled his disagreement. We wrapped the weird head in a Ziploc gallon bag and decided to go home. When we got back, Emilio put the thing in the garage with the motorcycle that was in constant repair on, placed it on a pile of the rest of the random shit he had accumulated lately. We smoked a few bowls and decided to clean out the fridge by warming up the collected unspoiled leftovers accumulated from the various stakeout joints of South Florida. A mountain of plantains, mofongo, partially eaten Cuban sandwiches and various other things awaited us. All in all, it was a pretty great night. Emilio couldn't sleep, so he ended up working on his Kawasaki until some ungodly hour in the morning. The dogs were very concerned, and I heard occasional whining and pawing at the door. When we got to work the next day, he looked fantastic for someone who had barely slept the night before. He had cleaned the floor spotless before noon, normally a chore he asked me to do, and still had energy to help me restock the live bait and a small shipment of craft beers. His trademark friendly demeanor had dropped in favor of a focused, more severe attitude. That being said, he was taking care of chores that had been ignored for weeks, so I didn't say anything. I wondered if he had ordered any blow or some energetic pharmaceutical off of Alpha Bay. When we got home, he tidied up the living room, which we were usually happy to leave a pigsty before eating, and going back to the garage to do some more work on the bike. I heard him moving about the garage, moving stuff around, and he had to make a trip to a tool store. The doggos, apparently not happy with the lack of affection the previous night, tried desperately to get Emilio to focus on them, but to no avail. That night, while I was sleeping, I heard a horrible ruckus in the garage, ending in one of the dogs making a brief shriek. Emilio and I made it to the garage at the same time, where I promptly grabbed the workbench table to steady myself as I almost slipped on the blood on the floor. I saw Hammond laying on the ground a few feet away, his legs twitching erratically. A bowling ball, which must have been sitting in the pile of shit which was once a relatively clean workbench, had slid off and landed on the poor dog's skull. Emilio stood motionless for a moment before leaning down to pet his friend one last time. He removed the bowling ball and began to dig a grave in his backyard. While he did this, I noticed the rock he brought back from the island. While he once stored random crap in the room, he usually put his stuff somewhere at some point in time. Now some car parts sat on top of his bench, and on top of those was something that almost looked like a sculpture. A log that had been worked over and smoothed rested on a transmission with 3 long pieces of lumber attached to it. And resting on top of it all was the weird little pale brown rock. I noticed that only a few things had changed on the bike though. I decided not to mention how weird it was. Over the next few weeks, we didn't talk much. He didn't seem to be taking it poorly though. He worked harder than ever at the shop. He gave me orders from people who needed this or that, and I raked in more money than usual, but little else. For almost a month he kept to himself and kept working on his motorcycle. For the most part, I tried to give him some space. 3 weeks after he buried Hammond, he missed work. He didn't call in or anything, he just didn't come with me in the morning. I spent the day thinking about what kind of reading my former coworkers must be engaged in at the moment. I missed having friends that spent their energy on intellectual pursuits. At least Benson and Jasper had taken to cuddling with me at night, which was adorable. When I came home, he was nowhere to be found. The garage door was locked, so I went around the side to look through the window. Benson and Jasper accompanied me happily. The exterior door was locked too, but the window showed that the motorcycle had a coat of dust on it. Behind that, however, it appeared that Emilio had removed the weird log thing he had clearly been working on, which made me breathe a deep sigh of relief. The workbench looked cleaner than it had been in years, but I was still nervous about Emilio missing work and acting weird. I was getting suspicious that he was on something, maybe some more serious shit. You can buy stimulants that are popular with foreign students on Alpha Bay that the DEA doesn't even know about. I mean that literally. The FDA hasn't approved or banned these substances, so they can come in easily, and that is in addition to the standard array of drugs. These usually have some kind of horrifying side effects. Normally Emilio was uncomfortable with any silence longer than a few seconds and would break up car rides with intentionally obnoxious music interspaced with dick and fart jokes. He had barely said a word to me in a little over a month. He was energetic and threw himself into cleaning and maintaining the store, which was now absolutely spotless, but he suddenly started avoiding customers. The day after I looked through the window of the garage, I took Jasper and Benson out for a walk after work, a duty I had happily taken on since Emilio became a less frequent companion to the dogs. Emilio had gone to work and apologized for missing the previous day. When we got back, I went into our backyard, which was generally considered the domain of the dogs and largely ignored due to the sheer amount of dog poo. Normally Benson and Jasper loved it back there, but they seemed nervous. After walking past the corner of the house, behind the garage, I noticed what looked like the shape of a person standing in a corner. I gasped and almost said something before I realized it was the sculpture Emilio was working on. An additional piece of lumber had been grafted on, giving the thing what appeared to be 2 legs and 2 arms. The wood had been heavily worked to form the shape of limbs, and had the telltale hint of orange common with date pine. The work was obviously no masterpiece, but it was clear that an incredible amount of effort went into it, with fully formed fingers and graceful-looking joints all in proportion to a human body, with the rock firmly affixed to the neck with leather straps. I was creeped the fuck out, but I made a note to compliment Emilio on his sculpture and try and strike up conversation with my once ebullient roommate. That night I had some kind of horrible nightmare, but all I remember was being back on that tiny mangrove island. I woke up covered in cold sweat and noticed that Benson and Jasper weren't sleeping next to me like normal. I went looking around the house but didn't see them anywhere. It looked like Emilio was sleeping for once and I started back to bed assuming that Benson and Jasper had taken up with him. Before I managed to get all the way to bed I heard a horrible shriek outside. I ran like hell to the rusted back door and hit the light so that I could see. It didn't take long to find Benson and Jasper outside. Benson was whimpering with his tail between his legs and has snuck inside the second he heard the door open. Jasper was writhing in the middle of the yard, with something on top of him, covered in blood. It looked like Emilio had placed his statue in the center of the yard and it had somehow fallen on Jasper. One of the wooden hands had run straight through the dog's back. I shouted for Emilio, but he never came. I threw the statue to the side, but removing it made the blood come out faster. I kneeled down to see if there was anything I could do other than to tell him he was a good boy for the last time. Jasper licked my hand a few times, whined and shut his eyes. I sat there for a while before the cops showed up. They asked if everything was alright and I told them that Jasper died. I didn't know how to describe what was going on without sounding nuts, so I just told them a statue fell on him. They asked to see it and, satisfied that it wasn't a person's blood all over me, gave me their condolences and left. I barged into Emilio's room without even knocking. The lights were off, but he wasn't sleeping. He was sitting on his bed, staring at a wall. "Your statue just killed Jasper, what the fuck are you doing?" I didn't really know how to express the accumulated amount of what the fuck I had experienced in addition to Jasper's death. Emilio stared at me blankly. "I just woke up. Did you take care of the body?" He said that he woke up as if that were an answer to anything. I decided at that point that it was time to find a new roommate and maybe a new job too. I shut the door without responding to the question and began to dig a grave for Jasper right next to the one Emilio had dug for Hammond. When I was finished, I took a look at the statue Emilio had been working on. It was covered in a thick shiny coat of blood that would have looked beautiful if it hadn't come from an animal I loved. It began to occur to me that Emilio had utterly lost his shit and may have killed Jasper himself. I wanted to burn the fucking thing, but I didn't know what Emilio would do and I wanted to make sure he was willing to let me take Benson, who was cowering in my bedroom. The next morning, Emilio was outside inspecting the statue, which he had propped up next to the garage and cleaned thoroughly. He was messing with one of the joints when I told him I would be moving out and wanted to take Benson with me. I didn't accuse him of killing his dog, but I didn't let a drop of friendliness slip out of me. I wanted my tone to make it clear that I suspected him of going deeply fucking insane. He barely turned to speak to me, staying focused on a joint that seemed problematic. Sure. Sorry to hear that, bro, let me know when you're out." I nodded, grabbed Benson, some clothes and my electronics and got in my thankfully reliable Toyota pickup. I have a shell over the bed, so I imagined I could sleep in a park if I had to. Thankfully a guy named Ed who buys a lot of weed and hangs out at the store had an extra bedroom that I could rent month to month. Benson was almost happy at the sight of Ted's waiting bacon snacks, but he would end up being quiet for a very long time after that. I went back to work the day after that, but Emilio wasn't there. I was hoping to talk to him, praying that he would show some sign of sanity, but he didn't show up the day after that either. Running low on clothes and anxious to make my move permanent, I stopped by to get my stuff last night. When I pulled up, I noticed that all of the lights were still on, including the one in my bedroom, but I didn't see anyone through the front windows. When I turned off my car I heard the sound of an electric wood saw in the garage. I walked around to the side window and saw Emilio hunched over the workbench near the saw, as usual. Except Emilio was a few inches taller and his normally white t-shirt was stained bright red. That was when I noticed the real Emilio lying on the ground a few feet away. I barely stopped myself from making noise when the statue Emilio had been working on turned away from the workbench and stared in my direction, still holding a bloodied piece of an arm. It moved, in a stilted but still graceful manner, like a particularly well-done stop-motion animation, towards the door. I ran like hell and managed to get into the driver's seat of my car in less time than it takes to exhale. As I pulled out of the driveway I saw the thing, wearing Emilio's clothes, try in vain to open the locked garage door. I tried to pretend I didn't notice that rock watching my car through the garage window. I don't know what I'm going to tell the cops, but if I try to avoid it and they find Emilio's body, I'll probably be blamed for his death. I'm going to a station now. I think I'll just say I don't know what happened, but I'm worried the thing might come looking for me.